Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
We also have Valentino Stoll.
Hey, now.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Alexandre Ruban. If you want to introduce yourself, let us know who you are, why you're famous, all that stuff.
Yeah, so my name is Alexandre, and I'm a Ruby on Rails developer from France. And I created a tutorial about Turbo Rails that I published, and apparently this tutorial had a great success. So here I am today. I'm really happy to be here.
Nice. Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been working on actually building out Top End Devs. If you're interested, you can go to topenddevs.com/podcast, and you can actually hear a little bit more about my story, about why I'm doing what I'm doing with Top End Devs, why I changed it from devchat.tv to Top End Devs. But what I really want to get into is that I have decided that I'm going to build the platform that I always wished I had with devchat.tv, and I renamed it to Top End Devs because I want to give you the resources that are going to help you to build the career that you want, right? So whether you want to be an influencer in tech, whether you want to go and just max out your salary and then go live a lifestyle with your family, your friends, or just traveling the world or whatever, I want to give you the resources that are going to help you do that. We're going to have career and leadership resources in there, and we're going to be giving you content on a regular basis to help you level up and max out your career. So go check it out at topenddevs.com. If you sign up before my birthday, that's December 14th. If you sign up before my birthday, you can get 50% off the lifetime of your subscription. Once again, that's topenddevs.com. So this is a tutorial on Turbo and Hotwire in Rails, which has kind of been a hot topic off and on here on Ruby Rogues. I'm a little curious just to kind of get us kicked off. I mean, is there a story behind you putting this together? I mean, were you working with people that needed it, or people asked you questions, or did it come from somewhere else?
Well, yeah. At my previous company, I was working on a project of code editor, so exactly the same as what we'll build in the tutorial. And it was built with React. And at the time, it was the very, very beginning of Hotwire, because Hey from Basecamp just went out. And so the gem was not included in Rails yet, but I was kind of seduced by the promise of not having to write any JavaScript to build some dynamic applications. And so I tried it out, and then I was, it completely blown my mind. And so I later rebuilt this quote editor with Hotwire, and I thought it would benefit a lot of people if I just document the process I went through. And that's what I did. So I kind of created this tutorial a bit like I didn't think about it. I just wrote it mostly as some documentation and published it. And yeah, I guess it helped a lot of people. I have more than 10,000 visitors per month on the tutorial, which is completely amazing. Like I didn't imagine it would reach those numbers. So I'm really happy about it. And yeah, that's the quick story of it.
Cool. We've got the expert here, folks. So let's ask smart questions, right? That's mostly a reminder to myself. So where do we want to start? Do we want to start with Turbo? Do we want to start with React Sucks? Do we want to start with Hotwire? Something else?
So I want to start with the history of Turbo. So if you remember way back in Rails 4 days, we got introduced to TurboLinks.
Yeah, I remember people hating
honestly,
on it.
It was one of those things that I would just disable in my application because it caused so many problems. Because I was using a lot of different JavaScript libraries that did not work well with TurboLinks, and it was just really annoying. But then when TurboLinks 5 came out, that kind of like shifted things where a lot of the libraries just worked with it or worked with very minimal effort. And so that was really cool. And around that same time, we got React. And I think a lot of people jumped off of the Action View bandwagon and went over to React because it provided a lot of client-side UI, UX components that you could quickly, and I'm not going to say easily, but let's just say slowly create these components that you would then be able to have rich UI and interaction. But then we got Turbo. And I think with Turbo and Hotwire, which is just Stimulus and Hotwire combined, we got Hotwire, which is just Turbo and Stimulus combined. That completely changed the game. We don't need to really have this idea of client-side frameworks within Rails applications and modern Rails applications. It's completely changed the dynamic. And a lot of what people would reach for with React, you don't need to do anymore.
Well, yeah, exactly. This is something that, like, in my previous company, when we decided to build a code editor in React, because Turbo Rails didn't exist at the time, we were a small team of 4 developers, and only 2 of us knew how to write React code, right? And there's also this problem with React that it's kind of complicated. It takes some time to learn. And once you're done with React, you also have like other libraries to learn, like, for example, Redux, if you want to keep state somewhere. And all of this makes it really hard to learn. And then, yeah, in most teams, you end up with a backend team and front-end team. And this is something that when you're a very small company, like we were at the time, you want to avoid, I guess. And this is one of the aspects that most amazed me is that if you want to learn Turbo, you only need like a couple of days because the API is very simple. Compared to React, it's a real bonus, I would say. And yeah.
Alexandre, I would love if you could walk us through, because I was going through your tutorial this week. Awesome. And I just love the experiments that you have set up throughout to kind of test what is happening with Turbo and the various parts of it. And I just want to, like, when we talk about Turbo Drive, right?
Yes.
Like, that's a piece of the framework, which was formerly TurboLinks, right? Like you were talking about, Dave. So could you break down on a higher level, like what else is included in Turbo Rails that makes it, because the Turbo Drive basically makes a single page application, right? Available by default in Rails. So what else is included in that Turbo Rails framework that adds to that? Snails.
Yeah. So in the JavaScript library, there are 3 different components, right? There's Turbo Drive, which makes it easy to like transform your app into a single page app because all the clicks on links and the form submissions become Ajax. So there's no full page reload anymore. And then there are 2 other components, which are Turbo Frames and Turbo Streams. And so Turbo Frames, they enable you to slice your page into different independent frames. Like when you click in a link that's in a frame, then you're going to replace this frame with the same ID from the other page. So this enables you to slice your page into different independent pieces, just like you could do as well with React. And then there are Turbo Streams, and Turbo Stream is kind of like in Turbo Rails, you can make Turbo Stream requests, and Turbo Stream requests, they are a special format in HTML where you have like an action and a target. And you can say, for example, I want to target this ID in the DOM and replace it with the HTML that's contained in the template. And so, yeah, this is for the JavaScript library. And then there's Turbo Rails, which is the Turbo integration for Rails. And so it comes with a few things, right? There's one object that is used to build Turbo Stream views. Like we can use the TurboStream.replace or TurboStream.create, append, prepend, all those things. And then there's the integration with Action Cable as well. Like you can say broadcast append to or things like that if you want to, broadcast some HTML each time a resource is saved or updated or destroyed, things like that. So it's quite a big library if you take the JavaScript part and the Ruby on Rails integration. And actually, I have another tutorial. So there's the tutorial that is free, and the tutorial that is free is like how to use the framework, so Turbo Rails. And there's another tutorial, but this one is paid, and it's about how to rebuild Turbo Rails library. But we're not talking about JavaScript, only the Ruby parts.
You know, one of the things that I love about Turbo Streams is that it doesn't render out the request back to the Rails application, doesn't render out the entire layout and everything. It's really just rendering out or sending back to the client just that Turbo frame tag with the ID. So the amount of data you're sending over the wire is much smaller. Whereas before, if you were doing UJS and Ajax requests, a lot of times you were going to get a lot more sent back over the wire.
you don't have the layout by default. When you stand back some turbo stream response, the layout is removed for you. And I think that there are kind of some interesting discussions around this, because, for example, this layout, you don't want it most of the time, but sometimes maybe you would like, to have a layout just to render Flash messages, for example. And so in the Turbo library I remember there were a lot of discussions about this. So it's kind of an interesting issue, yeah. But still, today there is no layout, included by default when you make a Turbo stream response. And so for Flash messages, it's kind of boring because you have to, specify it every time that you want to render a Flash message or something like that.
Yeah, but also the nice thing is, if you do have a situation where you are using a Rails engine or some other library where it does not play nicely with Turbo, you are able to disable Turbo on those specific areas.
Yes.
For example, like Devise. There are workarounds to get Devise working natively with Rails 7, Hotwire, and all that good stuff. But if you were not wanting to go through all those headaches of customizing the initializer and adding in your own failure handler, then you're able to just add the data turbo false. And then it just magically works. It just skips the AJAX request, does a page refresh if you're posting or whatever, and it works really well.
Yeah. And it's actually one of the things that we do in the tutorial. Like we installed Devise at some point, but I remember I was trying to find an issue or a way to make it work with Turbo, but I couldn't find one. There was like a video from Go Rails explaining that you could monkey patch some stuff, and that was like really complicated. And so I ended up saying, okay, maybe we don't need Turbo on your login or sign up page. So you can just disable it with a data attribute and it works perfectly. So Turbo is really like easy to work with, and disabling it is also very easy if you need. And so this is also something that is, it just works. Unlike, if you work with React, at some point you are tempted to make all your application work with React because you already invested so much. So I guess this is one of the nice things as well about Turbo. But as of today, I still work with React, so I'm not going to trash talk React too much. I do React at my day job, so,
I have to do React as well, but I don't have a problem trash talking it.
So speaking of talking, now that we're on the topic of React and that you have, extensive experience with React, Alexandre, and haven't gone through making all these tutorials and diving into Turbo, right? Have you found things maybe lacking in Turbo that you like from React and vice versa? Like, are there things that are missing from each that could go well if they were cohesive?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that one of the aspects I like the most about React is that you can create your components. And so this is something that we don't have by default in Rails. You have to use either Vue components or Flex, which is the newest addition to the list of Vue components gem. And so, depending on the size of the team you work in, at some point it makes some sense to have some Vue components because you want your UI kit to look the same everywhere. And so having components is nice, but this is something you can perfectly do with Turbo, and the Rails ecosystem has multiple gems to handle components in Ruby on Rails. And so, you don't need to go to the React route if you don't want.
Yeah. And I will say, in React's defense, if you were just using React as just sprinkles in your Rails application for some highly interactive content, it's not too bad, especially if they are simple components. My issue comes into play when you create one component, but then within there, you have another nested component, and then you have another nested component, maybe like 4 or 5 components in this overall feature thing. But then you need to pass data from the component deepest within up to the parent component at the top level. And that's where things, I think, get a real nasty in React. And that's not even talking about using the React router or Redux or anything like that. There's just kind of like the organizational stuff on how React works and within the DOM.
Yeah. Like passing state through multiple components, and then you end up having, I don't know, many files opened, trying to go from file to file with your state to know where it comes from. Yeah, that's something that's difficult. And like in my previous company where we had only this page, the code editor, that was really an interactive page that required React. Even though it wasn't too bad because we didn't go all into the React path, it was still a problem as a team because we didn't all have the same skills when it comes to React. And so even if it's on a single page, then it already creates some barrier between all the developers because React is a skill and it requires some time to learn. And so, yeah, this is even if you don't go all into the React path, I would say, then it still can be a problem if you are in a small team and then some of the developers can't work on this feature. So this is why also I really enjoy working with Hotwire.
Yeah, working with Rails controllers and views for so long, it's definitely seems to be a common problem, right? Of passing state around and where to put what, right? Like, because it's so easy from an active record standpoint, just talking about that, right? Like to create N+1s or to cause downstream problems because the state isn't kind of exclusively set up front. And it's kind of like there isn't really a strong opinion on how to trickle those down through the views, right? And I feel like we're starting to see that too with Turbo in that we're trying to figure out where to put the state.
Yeah, that's also true. If you have some state in Turbo, well, sometimes it's hard to manage it. You kind of store it into the data attributes when you really have to. And so, yeah, there are some cases when Turbo alone is kind of complicated to work with. For example, like recently I did an integration with Full Calendar. And so Full Calendar is a JavaScript library. And so you have if you want to create events into that calendar, you will have to create a stimulus controller that wraps the calendar. And then you have a form, but the form sends data to the server. And when the data gets back, it's kind of hard to put it back into the calendar that is really this kind of JavaScript library that's standalone. So there are some issues like this, like when you still have to do some JavaScript. And in that case, yeah, it can be a bit painful because you have to do it all by hand. You don't have libraries like React that just abstract the complexity for you. And so, yeah, but apart from this case, I would say that it's mostly easier to work with Turbo than React.
It's actually kind of funny you mentioned Full Counter because I just released at the end of August an episode on Full Counter and Stimulus.
Oh, yeah.
And then this weekend I'm preparing the high interaction part of it where you have two different browsers. You make a event on one of the browsers and then get broadcasted through Turbo to all the other browsers. And then Full Counter picks up that change and then refreshes the calendar.
Yeah.
So it's definitely possible to do. There are some nuances with it, but I think you'll find that that's just part of the Full Calendar library and some of its limitations that you had to work around. But I just thought that was funny. But Full Counter's kind of been one of those living JavaScript libraries that I always kind of go back to because it is so complex, because it has been around for the ages and the different approaches to it over the years has been so different just throughout the years, the approach they use to integrate it with the Rails app.
Yeah. So do you guys...
Yeah.
I was going to say, do you guys imagine now that the way that let's just focus on Full Calendar, like, do you imagine like Full Calendar Rails Turbo gems to start coming up that help wrap the complexity the right way in the Turbo framework specific for the JavaScript?
I don't know. Maybe Dave, you have an opinion. I will definitely watch your video when it comes out because that's my topic at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, for full counters specifically, it would be very difficult because when you are recording an event or updating an event on a calendar, every company is going to have their own specific requirements around that. So to build an engine around it, I think would be a bit cumbersome, or at least it would take in a lot of assumptions or still require a lot of work on the end user. But as far as just having certain kind of features in a stimulus controller that you can enable or disable through the initialization of the controller, I think that could be possible to have some kind of library for. But I mean, to have it fully featured, I think would be a real challenge because everyone's use case is a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, what I worry is that we start to head down the path that we headed down with Rails asset pipeline, right? Where we had like the railsassets.org for a while, where we were hooking into and then basically just like loading up the JavaScript libraries that we wanted to get it into the asset pipeline. I'm kind of worried that we'll go that way with Turbo, the way that it's set up with working with external libraries, where they're like full calendar, where they have specific things that are tricky to inject into the libraries for JavaScript, right? That need that JavaScript feedback.
Yeah. I think as far as the asset, the railsassets.org that you mentioned, I used to love that because now I had a way that I could actually manage my JavaScript versions. And I really think that's what import maps and Yarn will do. So I don't think it's a true fair comparison to say that we would need something like that. But there is a GitHub repository, I forget what it's called, but they have a bunch of different stimulus components that you're able to do a lot of like routine things that you would most commonly want to do. So I think something like that could be a good thing, or just having a snippets of code of stimulus controllers that can perform whatever function you want.
Now, do you need stimulus to use the Turbo framework, or is it just make it easier?
You don't. They are separate things, but they pair so nicely. So, Alexandre, what is your favorite part of the Hotwire umbrella? Like, what is the thing that gets you really excited that you just want to use every time you work on a Rails app?
Yeah, so I think that stimulus is more like for finishing touches, like maybe you want to make a drop down, so you're going to need to manage an open and closed state, things like that. But what I really enjoy about Turbo is probably Turbo frames, because then you just have to, you take one page and it's composed of different parts. So let's imagine that you have, an article with comments, with different authors or things like that. And you can manage each section independently, just like if they were in different pages. So you can still have like a very CRUD like organization. You're only making CRUD controllers that are very simple, and you can have all of the different resources on the same page. And this is something that I use a lot when I work with Turbo, one of my favorite parts. And also, there is this, if you want to make some real-time features, like, you want to make a game that could be multiplayer or something like that, then it makes it very easy to work with Action Cable, because you don't have to think about like almost anything, right? There's a very simple API to work with Action Cable with the Turbo Rails integration. And so you can just broadcast a piece of HTML. It gets replaced in the page of everyone who's connected to that channel. And that's it, with like only a few lines of code. So those are my two favorite features.
Hi, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And lately I've been coaching some people on starting some podcasts, and in some cases, just taking their career to the next level. Whether you're beginner going to intermediate going to advanced, whether you're trying to get noticed in the community or go freelance, I've been helping these folks figure out how to get in front of people, how to build relationships, and how to build their careers and max out and just go to the next level. So if you're interested in talking to me and having me help you go to the next level, go to topenddevs.com/coaching. I will give you a 1-hour free session where we can figure out what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and figure out what the next steps are. And then from there, we can figure out how to get you to the place you want to go. So once again, that's topenddevs.com/coaching.
What about you?
The Turbo frame tags, I think definitely, because just an example that you were given, but also think of like a dashboard. I think dashboards were kind of like that React go-to reason to use React a few years ago, or at least, in my small circle, that was the reason why my JS buddies were saying to use React. But now that's just no longer the case because you have a turbo frame tag. You add just that source attribute on there to some endpoint. And now that little tiny frame tag, which is a calendar, or it could be a graph or just a numeric metric or whatever, just makes a quick request back to the Rails application. You get the request back, and then you get the information displayed. It's so easy. And what's really nice about that is a lazy loading. Yes. That if you have a really large page full of images, graphs, charts, whatever, then you don't need to load all of that if the user is not scrolling down. So as the user scrolls down, it'll then make that request to the Rails application to get the data to then display.
Yes, and you also have that React-like feeling, when you have the little loader and you can lazy load your frames. So in the case of a dashboard, you can just have the first page with no data at first with all the loaders, and with lazy loaded frames, you can just have requests get fired to the different controllers that each handle one resource. And then you get your dashboard just like this. Compared to what we have to do in React, this is a great win, I guess.
It's kind of funny. Turbo frames to me seems like kind of just iframes, like re-implemented. Right? Except where it used to be specific to, or I guess more specific to external embedded websites, right? Which I'm sure out there, I haven't personally done it, but I'm sure somebody abused it to make internal requests, to make a bunch of iframes to split up the page. In a similar way, in JavaScript, you could also target those frames like a turbo frame, right? But so to me, that's how I'm wrapping my brain around turbo frames, in that it's just using the DOM and making these external requests to swap stuff out and connect things to the back end. What I like about it is that it doesn't use a virtual DOM, right? Like that's where I always see kind of some negative things about React, which can also be positive when you have caching and things like that in a virtual state, but it also decouples it, right? So like now that it's in the browser, all of these things are controlled by the browser rather than some external machine trying to resolve all of the dependencies in whatever is in it, right? Which is how React works. And I'm not sure about Vue. I don't really know the internals of it as much, but I'm kind of excited about that idea, right? But I do worry because of how it's implemented so much in parallel with how iframes kind of are. And I'm suspicious that the naming of turbo frames is kind of a parallel to that. I worry that browsers will implement their own version and then we'll have to worry about adopting this new thing, which maybe is too much to worry about at this stage. But it would be great if browsers had a native turbo frame that you can do this with,
Well, back in HTML4, we did have frames, like that frame attribute, if you remember those. Like how every single website was laid out. You had this big, long frame on the left. I
forgot about frames.
Your header title or your logo image was in a frame at the top. So when I first heard turbo frame tags or turbo frames, I was worried that's what we were going back to, but I'm very glad it's not.
I don't know. The user experience on frames was amazing.
There is something to be said about that.
Alexandre, I'm curious if you've looked into like speed, if you've done any benchmarks to see if usage of Turbo or Hotwire has kind of like reduced latency or improved like overall like page performance. Are you tracking with like Google Lighthouse or something to see if it's been improved there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And unfortunately, I will be unable to answer because at my previous company, I left right after we did the implementation of Turbo. And now I work with React only. So I'm very sad, but I don't have any answers to this.
So if we're talking about performance or speed in general, then I think especially with the adoption of if you're able to support HTTP2, where you have that living connection open and you're making multiple requests, then yeah, you can see a speed increase. But I don't think you can really compare it to React versus Hotwire in speed because you're both going to be making request back to the Rails application or to whatever API backend to get the data. If you're having to render ERB, then that could be slower than serving just the raw HTML, or the HTML is already loaded in React. You just then have to initialize that component. But if we're talking about speed, then we can't ignore the other halves of speed. How fast can you create a stimulus turbo view with live interactions, updates from the server, and all that stuff, broadcasting to other users? How fast can you create that in Hotwire, and how fast can you create that in React? And then let's go to speed on how fast can you fix a bug in Hotwire, and how fast can you fix a bug in a ugly React component. So.
Yeah, and there's also how much JavaScript you have to download from the server on initial page load when you're using React, which you don't have when you use Turbo because the library is much smaller. So yeah, I guess it's kind of hard to compare. Probably if we wanted to argue with a React fan, he would probably find a way to, to say React is faster. But I like how DHH says it. It's fast enough for the users. And so, at that point, do we care? I'm not sure. So this is the argument that I use now when I have arguments about performance. Okay, maybe it's slower, but if it's fast enough, then I don't care.
Yeah. I'll put it like this. I built something in React and then I was not happy. I built the same thing in Hotwire and I was happy.
Yeah. So this is also a great argument.
Yep.
I think familiarity speaks a lot too. If you were very vested into the React ecosystem, Vue or Angular, and if that is just what you do day in, day out, that's what your team is familiar with, that's what everyone in your organization is using, then it's probably a good fit for you all because you have that expertise there. But if you're starting out something new and you really don't know what to use, you don't have familiarity with React, you don't have familiarity with Hotwire, you are creating a Rails application, then I think hands down Hotwire wins.
Yeah, and this is something I'm wondering about because like all the companies that started to adopt React heavily, like the company I'm working at right now, it's probably very difficult to migrate to Turbo because everything's built in React. You have your design system in React, all your components, the teams know how to use React. And so we're never going to migrate. And I'm wondering if the startups that are created today, are they going to use Turbo much more than React? This is a question that I'm eager to have the answer about that one.
Yeah, it's interesting too because on JavaScript Jabber, I think it was last week, we talked to Mishko Hevery, who's the guy that created Angular, but we talked to him because he's created a new framework called Quick, and it's got some interesting features as far as the way that it fetches modules and things like that. But one thing that was really interesting is we were talking about Quick and talking about the product that they're building called Builder. It has a lot of this kind of thinking behind it where instead of having fully managed spa type approach, it's using some of the HTML2 features and, some of or HTTP2 features and some of the other things out there, and then letting you manage your pages in the same way that Stimulus does with just pulling in part of the page or, partial refreshes or things like that. And if you have a different UI, you may actually just click and it'll load another page that has different setup on it. Anyway, it was interesting to kind of see that some JavaScript folks are starting to look at an approach like this and kind of take it to heart.
And this is Quick, the front end framework, not to be confused with Quick, the new HTTP3.
No, it's the front end framework, QWIK.builder.io. It's the quick.builder.io is the website for that. Anyway, so I'm just curious as we dive into this. A lot of people like to test their code. So do you provide any kind of test helper, test setup with Rails Turbo?
There is a custom assertion in the Turbo Rails library. There is an assert Turbo stream assertion that you can use. So to be honest, I don't know if it exists in RSpec. Probably you have to create it yourself. But this is something you can use if you really want to test that the view is going to be rendered properly. So what it does, Assert Turbo Stream, if I remember well, it checks the target. So the frame that you're going to target and the action that you're going to send. So for example, it's used in a controller test or request tests where you can say like when you, when you create a new command, then you can say assert TurboStream commands. So the list of all the commands, and the action should be prepend or append. So this is the kind of assertions that you have built into the TurboRails gem. But apart from that, in the tutorial, I used only capybara tests if you want to have like full testing capabilities. But otherwise, I guess it's also kind of uncommon to test views too much. Like, for example, if you want to, like, it's part of the framework, right? So maybe you're not going to test that the frame is properly replaced. And if you want to really make sure, then you're going to use assert TurboStream to make sure that it has the right action and the right target. But apart from that, I don't test that much the views. What about you?
For me, it's basic. I mean, if it's, just basic, you clicked here and it made an XHR request and got whatever it got, right? I'll probably have some kind of unit test and maybe some level of controller test if I'm really concerned about anything beyond kind of the basic functionality that's already in Rails. And then on the front end, it's the same deal, right? If it's just a fundamental, hey, this is something that this framework does over and over and over again, then I tend to not test that so much. But if there's a complex interaction, if I've written a bunch of JavaScript in one of the stimulus controllers and I'm trying to make sure that it does what it's supposed to, I'll write a test around that. But I was just curious if you kind of included Jest or something and said, hey, here's an easy way to test your stuff. I also I have tested some of the fundamental framework functionality, but usually it's because I have some kind of thing that I screwed up and I want to make sure that I unscrewed it up and that it stays fixed.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes if we have like very complex stimulus controllers, then maybe it would make sense to test them with Jest. But this is something I don't do very much. Like, most of the time my controllers are really easy, kind of simple controllers. Like you want to open, a model or a drop down, or you want to just add CSS classes and remove them or things like that. And in that case, I don't test my stimulus controllers. And as we mentioned earlier, I don't test views that much. And so, I guess it just works, and that's great. That's what's great about it.
One thing I really liked about your tutorial was you built a design system from scratch and showed how kind of easy it is. I was really happy to see that, which I know there's a lot of like drive for tailwinds, that lots of people love that. And I enjoy it too, but it was nice to see that you don't need to do that. Just follow these principles.
Yeah, this is really funny actually, because everybody's telling me like, okay, I like the tutorial, but I really enjoyed the CSS part. And this is really funny because that's not at all the goal of the tutorial, right? I didn't want to use Bootstrap because you've seen it everywhere. And so I wanted to make like, as the code editor that we built is also on the website, I wanted to design it a bit. So this is why I ended up building my own CSS. But I really enjoy CSS as well. And so I have like a lot of rules that I use on every project. Like I set variables for everything, like the colors, the spacings, the font sizes. I store all of it in a variable file. And right after, it becomes really easy to make some CSS. Oh, and there's also the media query mixin that I use everywhere, like include if the size of the screen is, so I name them tablet, mobile and up, or tablet and up, or things like that, because I use a mobile first approach. And so when you have like media queries like this and CSS variables, then you're already done all of the job, right? So I guess it's one of the reasons Tailwind is so popular, because it already gives you the media queries and all the variables. But apart from that, you have to build all the stuff yourself, right? So I mean, I think that those two approaches are kind of equivalent, but yeah, it's a matter of preference after. And also, yeah, Tailwind people, they are going to say, well, I just want to stay in one file. I don't want to name my components. This is a strong argument in the Tailwind community. But in the end, you will still have to name your view component, because most of the time you don't keep the markup like this. Otherwise, it becomes hard to maintain. And so, yeah, the CSS part was really appreciated. So that's great.
Yeah, with Tailwind, you don't need to know any of the thousands of CSS like commands, components, or anything. You just had to know the thousands of Tailwind ones.
Well, yeah, but they match the CSS, right? So there's one utility per CSS declaration.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's exactly the same. For me, it's exactly the same, but written in a different format, right? So if I say text large in Tailwind, then it's the same for me to use my like font size variable text large. So it's exactly the same. But I mean, yeah, this is kind of funny because there's always this argument between Tailwind users and non-Tailwind users. This is why I don't want to give my opinion. But yeah. really my opinion is that it's the same. Like if you use Tailwind, and then it's the same as if you use media queries and variables in your CSS style sheets. I don't know what you think, but
I think that Tailwind basically looks like my computer vomited all over my HTML. I mean, yeah. I think that's probably the most accurate description that I can give Tailwind. So be sure to listen to this episode till the end, because one of my picks addresses that issue. But I've been a big Bootstrap fan ever since like release 2. And that's what everything I have created runs on. Except now I have been looking at Tailwind because it is intriguing to have a more consistent UI feel and stuff. But I still think it looks like vomit all over my HTML.
Yeah. And this is why, like, I do like both approaches, but I prefer having my CSS into CSS files just because it makes my HTML nicer. But apart from that, it's exactly the same approach whether you write. I mean, what Tailwind provides really is the media queries and the variables. That's my take on it. And so if I define the media queries and the variables into a CSS file, then it's the same, right? But I have a nicer markup and I have to name my components. So that's kind of the trade-off here.
I know we're talking about CSS a lot, but it's kind of funny, right? Because Rails, their like motto now is like giving you everything you need to know from going, from startup to public company, right? And CSS, styling your website, is like a pivotal part of that. Like you can't release a Rails app without styling anything. Like people won't use it, right?
Craigslist will like to argue that point.
Well,
Challenge
who uses
accepted.
Craigslist? To be honest, Craigslist has lost a lot of user base. And I think there's a lot to be said there, right? Is like,
and it's still styled. It's just minimalist.
The web is feature rich now, and people expect it to look a certain way. And personally, I would like to see some more opinionated styles out of the Rails template, where you can just Rails new and it looks nice too, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And even those days, that's when I start a new application, what takes the most time is actually the design, because Rails made such a good job at abstracting all the complexity. Like you want to make a CRUD app with Rails, it's going to take you very little time. You just make a scaffold and you're almost done, right? And so, yeah, you're left with the styling, which can be really tricky.
Yeah, let's talk about Rails G scaffold.
Valentino, what more do you want? It looks pretty nice.
When you can come back with a product that's making you enough money to live on your own, then I'll listen.
Based on the scaffold CSS?
Based on the scaffold only.
Yeah, but no, what Alexandre is saying, which makes a ton of sense, is that out of the box, you basically get all of the CRUD operations you want for free. And if you're good with JBuilder and friends, then you kind of get a JSON API out of it too. I mean, it doesn't solve necessarily like authentication and stuff off the bat, but you can pull in some gems, bolt some stuff together, and you're well on your way.
Yeah. And I do agree with your approach, Alexandre, about, if you don't need to bring in a CSS framework like Bootstrap or Tailwind or whatever else, then why bring it in? Because it's that kind of mindset that people got trapped into. Like, they don't know why they're bringing something in. They're just bringing it in. That's how we got so many React applications out there.
Yeah. Yeah. But
I miss jQuery.
But Bootstrap is like, it gives you a huge boost of speed. If you're really in a hurry to create your project, you get all those components and you don't have to redesign them by yourself. Because even though, like, whether you're using Tailwind or vanilla CSS, you're still going to have to redesign a button, redesign a form, redesign a model, redesign a navbar. And all of this takes a lot of time. And yeah, I mean, if you're really like making a project that you just want to try something, then I think it makes a lot of sense to use Bootstrap, for example, because you're going to have all your components, and then you just have to configure it a little to change the primary color to your brand color. And I'm a huge fan of Bootstrap as well, because I think it's like, if you don't want to write too much CSS, then you can just rely on that and customize it a bit, and it will look good enough.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Yeah, with Vue component, I was kind of hopeful that there would turn into some kind of front-end library available that would snap into Rails, right? Which I know there is some work out there to make Vue components like this, like MateStack as an example, which is built on top of Vue, but it hooks into Rails because a lot of the backend can be written in Ruby for some of the components, right? But I was hopeful that we would get that kind of, which I know Vue component isn't part of Rails. And I know why there's hesitation, but it's just, I have a feeling, we just keep recreating more alternatives too, right? To do these same things where we have these isolated things that we want, which basically is where Turbo Frames is driving, right? Is you have an isolated component and you want to update its state and, swap it out with things, but there's no like opinionated way to display that, right? It's use one of these frameworks if you want that kind of functionality, right?
I don't know if that's really a bad thing, because if you remember back in the Bootstrap 2 and 3 days, any website that was using that framework, you could tell instantly, oh, they're using Bootstrap.
Yes.
Oh, and yeah. I think we would get that exact same thing with Rails, and I think it would actually hurt the Rails community more than it would help it, honest opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And also probably is one of the reasons like why less and less people are using Bootstrap today, because they want their website to look more unique. And this is one of the pains I have with Bootstrap, is like when I use it and don't heavily customize it, then the website ends up looking like all the websites. And yeah, so this is probably something you can't cut. If you want to have a really nice design, then you have to write your own CSS. There's no way around.
I mean,
but you can bolt stuff on top of it to give it a different enough look. Anyway, go ahead, Valentino.
I was just going to say the advantage of something like Bootstrap, especially now with the current version, is like you could buy a new Bootstrap theme that could make it look unique pretty easily, and you didn't have to do any work. And we don't really have that in Rails, other than using Bootstrap and buying a theme for it, right? Or some other alternative, like there are Tailwind ones too, but you have to like make all of the elements and things in certain ways, and it forces you into whatever right pattern that is. And that's kind of where I'm getting at, is like we have no kind of framework to inject some theme into it, which could be beneficial, right? Like, I understand, Dave, your point. We don't want everything looking the same, for sure. And if we had a default, maybe that would encourage it to look the default every time, for sure. I certainly don't want to customize CSS if I'm just trying something out, right? But I don't want to customize CSS either way, to be honest. So I don't know where the best thing. I just know that there could be something extra that could be provided that is standardized, right?
Yeah, that would be nice. And I think that Joel Draper, who is creating Flex, but I don't want to speak for him, but I think it's one of his idea, like to have a standard library of components that you could just use, like, Vue components, but so it's kind of the same idea, but you would have some default styling and probably would be nice. But I'm not 100% sure it's going to happen soon. So we'll have to ask him.
All right. Well, anything else we want to jump on here before we do picks? All right. Let's do picks. Hey, folks, if you love this podcast and would like to support the show, or if you wish you could listen without the sponsorship messages, then you're in luck. We're setting up new premium podcast feeds where you can get all of the episodes released after Christmas 2020 without the ads. Signing up will help us pay for editing and production. And you can go sign up at devchat.tv/premium. Dave, share some picks.
All right. So I'm going to throw out there, I am a big Bootstrap fan, but I'm also been familiarizing myself with Tailwind. And I very much dislike the HTML, CSS markup vomit all over my HTML. So my pick today is called Daisy UI, which goes on top of Tailwind. And they've taken a Bootstrap component kind of feel to it, where if you want a nicely styled Bootstrap looking button, then you just add the class button primary, secondary, or whatever, and then it'll apply all the proper Tailwind styling to it. And it's very extensible and very configurable with different themes, just out of the box, including a instant dark mode. So you get that for free, basically. So I've been playing around with that, and it kind of makes it, kind of puts Tailwind in check and brings it back into more reasonable, finished HTML markup.
Cool. Valentino, what are your picks?
So I have 2 picks here. My first one is my coworker, Ben Simpson. He wrote this awesome article on how we're integrating Neo4j into our stack and building a kind of a data pipeline. If you're not familiar, Neo4j is a graph database, and we use it for a lot of, connecting data. It's super fast and makes things much easier to use than a traditional relational database. And my next pick is Ruby Kaigi's going on. I'm half following along with their virtual event where I can, and I'm really excited to dive into some of those videos as they come out, probably in a few weeks. So check those out.
Awesome. So I'm going to throw out some picks. I managed to get around to playing board games with my friends again. So I have new board game picks. Of course, I have to go find the name of the game. So let me talk about some other stuff too while I figure it out. Oh, here we go. The game we played was called Irish Gauge, and it's relatively simple. Board Game Geek gives it a weight of 2.36. It is, we were joking, but it really does kind of line up with it. It's kind of a mix between Acquire, if you've played Acquire. If you haven't, I should pick that next week because it's a fun game. But Acquire and Ticket to Ride. And so effectively what you wind up doing is you build trains between cities in Ireland, and you can take actions like build trains. You can buy stock in the train lines. You can upgrade a city, stuff like that. Anyway, it's pretty awesome. I've really, really enjoyed playing it the other night. They have 2 follow-on games with it too, and I haven't played those yet. But they get progressively more complicated. But anyway, Irish Gauge, you can play it with 3 to 5 people. We played it with 4. And so, yeah, you build the train lines out, and then when you call for dividends, then you look at the number of cities that it connects to of certain kinds, and then you pay out the money, right? And you could do dividend, right? And run the game out of money, I guess. But anyway, it was really, really fun and relatively simple to figure out and play. In fact, the instructions for the game, if you've ever played board games that have like a booklet that come with them, here's how you play the game. This one, it was 1 sheet front and back for the directions. So it was pretty simple. I think it took us about an hour to play it. And yeah, it was fun. So I'm going to pick that. And then I've been playing with some stuff. I have been banging my head against the wall with like building courseware and stuff in Rails. And I've kind of been playing with Kajabi again, and I'm really liking it. So I'm going to pick Kajabi. It doesn't give like the exact structure I want, but I think it gives stuff that I can use, and I want to start putting stuff out there for people to use. So anyway, that's one thing I want to shout out. And then the other thing I want to shout out about is I'm getting pretty specific on the things that I can help people with in their careers, just kind of figuring out what you're going to do with your career and how that can make you happy, and finding fulfillment, and maybe doing something that's a little bit outside the mainstream of, working 10 to 15 years in order to become a top end, highly demanded senior developer, and instead maybe, be putting out courses, or, working for the company that really, hits all the check marks that you have for the kind of job you want, or being able to move up more quickly than, waiting around for the 3, 5 or 7 years or 10 years or whatever it's going to take for them to want to hire you at the level you want them to. And I've kind of skipped a lot of steps in my own career and made it work. And so I want to show other people how I'm doing that. So if you're interested in any of the coaching on any of that stuff, I'm kind of working out my signature method for that, and helping people figure out how to be trailblazers in their own careers and be able to do that in a few years instead of a long time. So if you go to topenddevs.coaching, topenddevs.com/coaching, you can get on a call with me and we can talk about what you want and how you can get there and how I can help you. So I'm just going to throw that out there as something that I'm doing. And finally, the last thing is I am starting a developer book club, and we're going to do weekly calls. I have enough connections to where I can typically get the author. And if I can't, then I can typically get somebody who's enough of an expert in whatever the book's about to come and, participate in the call. So if you're interested in doing that, just go to topenddevs.com/ I think I'm going to put it under courses, and then you can sign up for it. But we'll just do a book every month or two, depending on the length of the book and the amount of stuff we have to cover. And we'll just kind of roll through them. I haven't picked the first book, so if you have thoughts on the book that people ought to read, let me know. But anyway, those are my picks. Alexandre, what are your picks?
I didn't really prepare a pick, but I watched one conference of the RailsConf. I don't know if it get counted as a pick, but it was the one on Active Record. I have to find it back, actually. It's a conference that explains the main classes of Active Record and how they work together.
Oh, cool.
And it was really, really, really interesting. Like my favorite talk for this year, I just found it back. So it's called Reflecting on Active Record Associations by Daniel Colson. It was really, really interesting. Like in 30 minutes, you know the main classes, what they do, how they're linked together, and you can start, reading the source code of Active Record if you feel like it. It's probably a bit ambitious, but it was a really great talk.
Cool. All right. If people want to check out your tutorial or get in touch with you some other way, how do they find you?
You can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Alexandre_Ruban. And the tutorial is on Hotrails.dev. So you can find me there. And my Twitter link is also on the website.
Awesome. All right. We'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thanks for coming. This was a lot of fun to kind of dive into and talk about. And until next time, folks, max out.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.